Alrighty, so thank you for joining us this Friday night for a special discussion of this stunning book from UQP, The First Time I Thought I Was Dying by Sarah Walker. It's a stunning collection of essays about those awkward spaces where our bodies intersect with society. Before we jump into things, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I'm currently on in Meanjin. That's the Yagara and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the lands of which you're all joining us from on Zoom tonight across Australia. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Some general housekeeping for our audience. You're welcome to have your video on, but you will be muted for the session. But if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and I'll get onto those. Also, make sure you're set to speaker view. That way you'll be able to see Sarah and Carody in full screen. Once I wrap up here, I'll send through a link of where you can purchase the book. And this will also show you how to use the chat function, which is very important for our Q&A session. And we'll host that towards the end of the event. So at about 7:15 or 7:20, but feel free to send your questions throughout. Because it's the worst when you think of a question and then you forget it by the time Q&A rolls around. So just feel free to send them through and then I'll pass them on to Sarah at the end. So that's all from me, I think, in terms of the nitty gritty, but I'd love to introduce you to Carody Culver, who will be taking things from here. Carody is senior editor at Griffith Review and a freelance writer and editor. Her work has appeared in publications including Peppermint, Kill Your Darlings, Books and Publishing, and Archer. Over to you, Carody.
Thank you, Yana, and thank you, Avid. And thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm also on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce everybody to Sarah Walker, author of this wonderful essay collection, The First Time I Thought I Was Dying. You can purchase a copy without the sticky notes that I've got stuck to many of its pages. Sarah is a writer, artist, and photographer. She makes work about anxiety, control, and intimacy in text, video, and immersive installation across Australia and internationally. She is a Walkley nominated essayist and critic, and she co-hosted the podcast Contact Mike. She's one of Australia's most experienced arts photographers, and she lives on Wadawurrung country in Geelong, where she surfs badly and also gardens badly. I should make clear that those assessments of Sarah's surfing and gardening skills are her own and not mine. So, Sarah, your book is like a map of our physical selves. It charts a course through the pleasure and the pain and the confusion and contradictions of existing in a body. It's about that porous membrane between our bodies and our minds and between our bodies and society. It's about losing control and learning to embrace chaos. It's also about sex and death, and it's got queefing, vomiting, and popping pimples. It truly has something for everyone. And it's also an incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking read. It is a little bit ironic that we are doing this launch event for your book about the body in this quite disembodied way on Zoom. But I thought that the pandemic might be a good jumping off point for our conversation tonight. So you put together the pitch for this book in early 2020 when the world changed. Really, it changed for you in two ways. Obviously, there was COVID, which shifted everything on its axis for all of us. But you also lost your mother very suddenly. Can you talk about how those two experiences shaped the writing of this book?
Yeah, absolutely. It was it was a wild time. I don't recommend going through a pandemic and major grief at the same time. It wasn't terrific, but yeah, I mean, in many ways, the writing of the book during all of that kind of swirling strangeness and emotion and isolation was quite a centering experience, because it forced me to clarify something in my thinking when everything else was just these kind of like big fizzing kind of fireworks going off around me, where I'd kind of just be surrounded by this map of thoughts and constant terrors and behaviors that I'd always kind of done of being very attentive to like physical symptoms in my body, all of a sudden became totally catastrophic. and it turns out when you're grieving, your body reacts in a way that is quite similar to an immune system reaction. So I would just start shaking all of a sudden, or kind of just develop a fever. And yeah, I tell you what, I got a lot of COVID swabs. So yeah, it was such an embodied time. And obviously, you know, writing can be a very disembodied act. It's something I've described it to my partner before as going downstairs in my own head. And that can often feel like a time where I completely lose track of my corporeality. And so in some ways, having to be so attentive to my physical being during the period of writing, I think really strengthened the book and made me better able to clarify what it is to kind of be embodied and to struggle with that and to try to come to some sort of grace with it.
It really comes across in the essay that deals specifically with that time in the book, which is the final piece. It really comes across as this kind of incredibly surreal experience, and yet this weird duality of being very disembodied but at the same time being so very much in your body, and just the intense anxiety that causes. I have to say that you had me with the very first line of this book, which is, if my thoughts had a genre, it would be body horror. You also write in your introduction that you've always been suspicious of your body. And I think that's such a relatable sentiment. And obviously it's one that body horror really gruesomely and effectively taps into. Why do you think so many of us are primed to feel this innate suspicion of our own bodies?
I mean, I think as a person who occupies a female body, I'm very aware that when I was young, while like my brother, basically from the second he was born, was just like, what's that? I'm just going to like physically encounter it. And it doesn't matter if it hurts. I'm going to throw myself off things. I'm going to bruise myself. And I was always so frightened of being hurt, of being out of control. And I think I do feel like partly women are socialized to encounter the world in that way, to be like, oh, don't fall over, you'll hurt yourself. Don't do that, you'll hurt yourself. Oh, you're like bruises, gross, yuck. Yeah, there's this kind of trope of women being like, no, I broke a nail, but also this kind of expectation that women remain in pristine condition at all times. And yeah, like I've read a lot of writing about women kind of discovering the abjection of their body and the possibility of hurting it and that being all right. And that was a thing that took me a very long time to learn. I've recently started learning to skateboard, which has been hilarious because I have no sense of balance and I'm terrified of moving at any speed beyond walking. And so when we go to the skate park, there's these children, they're mostly young boys, on the, you know, like 6-year-olds on these skateboards and scooters, just doing these incredible daredevil stunts. And I'm so jealous of that period of time because I've never had a period where I haven't been frightened of my body existing in the world. And I'm trying to kind of struggle a bit of that back now in my 30s. Yeah,
it's interesting, isn't it? It is true. It's amazing to watch kids and see, especially, male children, and how kind of free they are. And I think definitely as a woman, you do kind of go through the world having a very, very different awareness of your body. I think that bodily suspicion and body anxiety often go very closely hand in hand. And there are so many things that our bodies do that we're encouraged to think of as like really disgusting. And you touch on this in a number of different and really fascinating ways in your book. One of those things, of course, is vomiting. And you have an essay, Honeycomb and Waterfall, where you talk about your emetophobia. That's a fear of vomiting. And you actually didn't vomit for 19 years.
I nearly made it to
incredible.
round numbers. Yeah.
So close.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you learned to let go, figuratively and literally, and how that changed the way that you perceive your body?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that essay is kind of one of the hearts of the book, because it was during the writing of that essay that I really came to understand that this fear of losing control was such a central fear for me in my life. I think I've tended in the past to consider my various kind of like phobias or things that I fixate on to be quite discreet. And so writing that essay was kind of a moment of being like, oh my God, all of these things are connected in this central fear. And I think it's a fear that it's not just mine. I think it is a fear that we all really have, existing in a world that kind of tells us that we have to be in control at all times and living in bodies that will not be controlled. So yeah, I mean, there are many ways in which I behave that are kind of based on my childhood anxieties, but yeah, like vomiting has always been, from when I was very young, a really, really deep fear. And I think if you'd asked me to really identify exactly what I was frightened of, I don't think I could have articulated it, except that it felt really, really bad and I didn't want it to happen. And you would be amazed by what you can achieve with the application of a great deal of anxiety and an absolute refusal to let go. And then when I got to university, I kind of encountered, so when my mum was a nurse, and she was, whenever drugs came up, she was very adamant that people who took drugs were bad people and criminals, and the ingestion of any drug would give you an immediate psychotic breakdown that would destroy your life, which I fully believed for a really long time. I remember going to a kid on the street had a party, and I went when I was about 16, and I could smell pot, and I was like, oh my God, they are taking drugs. There's drugs happening on my street. And I came home, and my parents were like, why did you come home so fast? And I was like, oh, no reason. There's no reason. It was fine. It was great. So yeah, I got to university and I met all these people, and all these theatre people did things like have sex before marriage, and it was fine. And no one you just spontaneously combusted from that activity. And they took kind of a lot of drugs, and then they were also excelling in their studies. And my little sheltered mind was so blown. And I sort of, yeah, I went through various periods of my life of being like, I've got to find the thing that'll let me learn to let go of control in a kind of joyous or cathartic way. And so when I was young, I thought it might be religion. I went and gave it a real red hot go with God. And then had an alarming experience with Planetshakers, which is the Melbourne chapter of Hillsong, which was terrifying. And I was like, oh, I don't think what's happening here is God or the Holy Spirit. I think this is just theatre, and it's an excuse for people to let go of something. So maybe I should just go to the theatre instead of this thing where we all pretend that the Holy Spirit is coming to us and then get whisked away into side rooms to dedicate ourselves to Jesus. And then when I got to university, I was like, it could be drugs. And then I tried taking mushrooms, and it turns out it wasn't drugs, because I love reality, and didn't feel great about not being able to. But again, I had this moment. I was holding onto the floor with my fingernails, being like, I think I have a problem here. I think this is really teaching me something about letting go and how I don't want to do it. And yeah, so through a very long period of kind of processing and learning, and there's so much writing about this that seems to be coming up a lot at the moment. There's a few themes that seem to be coming a lot in things I'm reading at the moment. One of them is that people are really into swimming in cold water. There's a lot of that.
Yeah.
And another one is this deep human need for something kind of a bit magical and a bit beyond ourselves, and processes of catharsis and of sort of gathering and ritual. So yeah, there's this real kind of like niggly need that I'm noticing a lot in things I'm reading. But yeah, long story short, I've managed to get to a point now where I'm physically capable of vomiting. I still don't enjoy it and try to avoid it. But yeah.
But it was part of that.
Quite a ranging essay, that one, but yeah.
Yeah, part of that process of gradually kind of learning to let go.
Yeah.
Tell us more about is it the Planetshakers?
Okay, so I was about 15, and I just want you to picture the face of someone who has never been in trouble in her whole life. Like when I was in grade 6, I got detention because I whispered the answer to a spelling test question to my friend, and I cried for like 3 days. So yeah, so I'm very naive, and we went as an excursion with my church youth group. So there were 2 adults there and a bunch of young people, and we walked into this enormous hall that felt more like a gig than it did a church. There were thousands of people there, a huge stage, a huge backdrop, there was a band, there were lighting effects with like big movers and hazers. And then there was a visiting priest from America, who I presume was the reason we'd gone. So a few things happened that made me think that maybe this wasn't the place for me. The first was that they played a video about how they'd gone on a mission to Africa and they'd achieved 300 salvations in this small village. And I was like, wow, ooh, okay. And the salvations had been mostly like baptizing children and being like, you're in now, God loves you. And then they passed around the offering, which I had experienced as put $2 in the little plate, and this a slip where you put in card information, and the minimum donation was $25. And I was like, okay. And then the service began in earnest, and this man, this preacher from America got up on stage, and then the band started, and then this song started, and the words came up above us, and then the lights all dimmed and started going jazzy colors, and the audience started singing along with this very repetitive kind of hypnotic music. And then as this tension built in the space, the priest, who'd been kind of talking about how God was terribly unhappy with us all because we were all sinners, he dropped to his knees and he burst into tears and he went, God, I have failed you. And then this wave swept through the audience and people just lost their minds. People were crying, people fell to the floor and were convulsing, people were speaking in tongues, which I'd never experienced before or since. It was, yeah. And I was standing there looking around being like, I feel very unsafe, but also I could feel myself wanting to go with it. I could feel it trying to tug me into kind of transcendence, but I was like, oh no, this isn't good. This doesn't feel like, I feel tricked into this. And so I just stood there kind of like gripping the seat in front of me, looking around, and everyone was like either, you know, like in raptures or looking quite placid. And I was like, what the fuck is happening? And then they were like, if anyone is ready to give themselves to Jesus, come forward now. And a bunch of mostly young women came forward and then were whisked off into a side room. And then the service ended and then everyone just had a cup of tea. And I was like, whoa, I did, wow.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow.
It was look, I'd recommend it purely as an experience, but
yeah, completely bananas.
Yeah.
Look, I think it sounds like you chose well when you decided to go into the kind of the non-religious form of theatre. Tell us about that. So you mentioned in your book you've had lots and lots of acting experience. So you were in a TV series when you were a teenager, and you've also done a lot of theatre work. How do you think that has shaped your relationship with your body over the years?
It's been, I mean, speaking of catharsis, what theatre often provided, which is something I really miss now, is the opportunity to just be in a room with a bunch of people and be really weird and free with your expressiveness. Like, there's not many places in contemporary society when you can walk into a room and just start yelling or just rolling on the floor or crying or screaming, and everyone's like, yeah, you're just working through the scene. But then also, because I sort of write in the book about how this thing tends to happen with young artists and young theatre makers especially, where they believe that it's their job to disrupt sort of the placidity of society and shock everybody out of their complacency, and that the only way to make people feel things is to kind of hurt them physically and emotionally. And so a lot of the work that young theatre makers make is pretty unsafe, both for the performers and for the audience, especially for the audience. I think, you know, like that, I did things with my body on stage, which I look back on and I'm just like, God, that was dumb. And I sort of knew at the time that it was dumb, but it never occurred to me that there would be people in the audience watching me pretend to be sexually assaulted or pretend to be murdered by a lover, or who really would have had experiences analogous to those that I was portraying, and was kind of reveling in portraying, because I had never, you know, like a lot of the people who I knew, we'd lived these very sheltered experiences, and we'd never experienced violence like that. Most of us had never had sex, and we were obsessed with it. And the way that we played that out was really not well managed and was really unsafe. And I should really point out that is getting better across all stages of the theatre world. Certainly at universities, partly that's being driven by the staff, and a lot of it's being driven by young people who are like, hey, we want trigger warnings. Hey, like trauma exists and we know about it and we don't want to do it to each other or to anyone else. But yeah, I write in the book about the fact that these young makers who are so gung-ho and so determined to create the work at any cost, then go on to become mid-level makers and then high, professional makers, and often their processes don't change very much. And there are systems of very complicated hierarchy and experience. So you can have a new grad from a drama school working with an actor who's had 40, 50 years experience, and those people are not equal in that room. And so there tends to be a lot of things being swept under the rug, people not talking about things, people just flat out not feeling comfortable saying, hey, I don't feel great about that. So when Me Too occurred in the film industry in America, I really vividly remember sitting and having conversations with actors who were like, holy shit, if they only knew what we did and continue to do, like, we'd be fucked. We'd all be fucked. And most, there have been some kind of high level cases which have really pointed out certain performers and certain processes and said, hey, this is actually really not cool. And there's increasingly processes of having intimacy coordinators to be in the theatre the same way that fight choreographers always have. But yeah, I think that the arts really suffer from this idea that there's something magical about creation, and that if you try to make it safe or process driven, it strips out the magic, when in fact, really the opposite is true. Writers do it as well, being like, yeah, no, I've got to be drunk to write, otherwise I can't do it. Or I can't maintain a relationship while I'm working on something. But yeah,
it's this kind of mythos, isn't it, of the tortured artist, that you have to be in a bad place in order to create art. And that's one of the most fascinating essays in your book, is the one where you talk a lot about your theatre work, and you talk about Me Too. And I thought I loved your observation where you talk about trigger warnings, and how initially, of course, there was this huge uproar. Everybody was furious. How can you possibly create great art if you have to tell people what's going to happen to them? And then you make this point where you say, it's such a good line. You say, when I was 20, I would have hated the idea of a trigger warning, but now that I'm sort of older and wiser, I definitely see the value in it. And you say, let me decide what my heart is ready to take, which I think is a lovely line that all of us, can definitely learn something from. So it is really interesting to see from your writing in this chapter how the industry is evolving, and how young people are bringing a completely different sensibility to, how you can still create great art, but maybe just be a little bit more thoughtful about it. Speaking of strange times and the times in which we live, Rebecca Giggs has a great cover quote for your book, where she has this line about how we live in an unparalleled age of self-surveillance, a peak moment for body estrangement. And I think your book captures this paradox really beautifully, particularly your essay about photography, which is the first one in the book. It touches on lots of different things, but a lot of it is about your practice as a photographer. We're obviously living in a time when many of us have become amateur documentarians of our own bodies because of, smartphones, etc. How has that changed your practice as a professional photographer?
It's been really interesting across nearly 15 years of photographing people. When I first started photographing people, most people I knew had never had a really good photograph of themselves taken. And so you would show people the back of the camera and they would be kind of amazed by it and be like, oh my God, that's what I look like. Wow, I'm so 3D. And now when I photograph people, photography is as a role, it requires so much trust. You have to develop so much trust with your subject because you are holding their image in your hands. And increasingly, as people become more used to controlling their own image through social media and through their own photography, there is the push and pull has gotten more complicated, because if you photograph yourself with your phone from here, certain things happen. One of them is that you tend to look slimmer around your chin. Your eyes tend to look a bit bigger. The bottom of your face becomes more heart-shaped. And you're also kind of pointed towards the light, so you get used to the light falling on you in a certain way. And the camera distorts the shape of your face in a way that is reasonably substantial. And then when you photograph someone from 3 meters away with a 200mm lens, it compresses space in a way that photographers call quote unquote more realistic. But that is not a way that anyone is used to seeing themselves. It makes your neck look a lot stockier than you're used to seeing it, makes your face look a lot rounder, your eyes look a lot smaller. And that is closer to how you look. I mean, you know, part of that writing is about the idea that vision and the camera, all of those things are labile. They're in motion. There is no visual truth. There is no visual reality. I find, for example, that when I look back at photographs I've taken of people who I now know and love very deeply, if you look at the photographs I took of them when I first met them, they look like different people because I don't love them yet. And so there's different qualities to their face that I'm noticing. There's different expressive characteristics. So yeah, when you show someone an image that is shot in a way just with lenses that they aren't used to using, it can be really confronting because we have a very structured image in our heads of the way that we look. Now, I think now more than ever. So yeah, it can make the job very complicated, and people expect more editing to be done on the image because everyone knows about face and everyone knows that you can just whack a filter on your Zoom, for example. So yeah, and you know, you have these very complicated conversations with people where some things people ask for, you say yes, of course. Someone says, I've got a pimple, please remove the pimple. Great. But then you've got someone who says to me, hey, look, the pandemic's been kind of difficult. I put on a bunch of weight. Can you make that not the case? Or photograph me in such a way that I don't look fat? And it becomes a very deeply complex experience. And I'm aware of it with myself as well. Like I take photographs of myself and I edit them. I don't change the shape of myself, but my skin looks better in the photos than it does in real life. And I am, dodging and burning the light on my face. And yeah, I'm very aware that the image of myself I'm putting out into the world is not quote unquote realistic. It's a version. And we're all really used to reading. We're all aware that we edit our own images, but we tend to read the thousands of images that we receive every day as fact. And that is a complicated state to be in.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to see how people's understanding of the camera and the photograph is evolving as well. You have this great moment in that essay where you talk about how when you first picked up a camera, you used to take lots of pictures of kids because they were great subjects. They would just kind of get on with their business and you could just snap away. But now when you aim a camera at a child, they immediately know that you're taking a picture of them and they're like posing and it's completely shifted, even like I imagine super young kids, because they're just so used to having phones or adults around them having phones and pointing them at the kids, and so much of our lives is documented now in a way that it wasn't even 20 years ago. So it's interesting to see how that is changing our perceptions and our understandings, even if we have that conscious knowledge of knowing the trickery that photography can achieve.
It still means that we tend to be really good at viewing ourselves as objects rather than subjects, and that's it's a thing that it takes a lot of awareness to process and work through.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a nice segue to my next question. You talk a lot in this book about mental health, which of course is so inextricably linked to the body. And in one essay, you recount this really fascinating conversation that you had with a psychiatrist. His name is Steve Ellen. And he says to you that we think of ourselves sort of in every era, really. We think of ourselves as being beset by all of these mental health problems, like all of us are sick, all of us feel terrible. Yeah. But he says, really, that's an illusion. We just now, today, we have much better ability to measure those conditions. Did your conversation with Steve change the way that you think about your own mental health experiences?
I think it did, and in kind of two ways, one of which was quite surprising. The first was just him saying, like when I said, everyone I know has a mental health diagnosis. Everyone I know is on medication. What the fuck is going on? And he laughed and he said, look, in the 40s and 50s, no one knew how to measure who was mentally unwell. So they went to doctors and they went to police people, and they'd be like, hey, police, how many people do you reckon are crazy? And the police would be like, no, like 1% of the population. And they were like, okay, cool, great, good chat. And then in the 60s, I think they started sending out surveys en masse to houses, and they got the results back, and there was just uproar. They were like, oh my God, there are so many people with depression and anxiety. We had no idea about this. I think for a long time, there was a bit more awareness of like levels of schizophrenia, for example, have remained a bit more consistent in the data, because when you have a condition like that, it is more, it makes it harder to operate, quote unquote, in a standard way in society. But things like depression and anxiety, which are a bit easier to pretend that you don't have, people were just shocked by the numbers of this data that came back. And then in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, we started changing the diagnostic criteria for depression and anxiety. It's easier than ever to be diagnosed with one of those conditions, which is great, makes it easier to get help. And stigma is slowly vanishing. He sort of said in the conversation, when he first became a psychiatrist, people said to his parents, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Everyone was so ashamed of the idea of him being a shrink. Oh my God, he's working with crazy people. And he said he'd go to the pub with his dad on a Saturday, and people would avoid them. They wouldn't speak to them. And now he walks in, the RSL, and guys are like, Steve, builders are like, hey, I wanted to talk about this depression thing. And, you know, there's these conversations we've never had before. So that I found very reassuring. And then he said, you know, we've got all these ways of dealing with mental health disorders, and medication is one of them. Therapy is another one. Denial's a pretty good one, to be honest. He said, you know, I have patients come in and they have had some really fucked shit happen to them, and they've just pushed it down right to the bottom of their psyche. And they come in and they're having a bit of a breakdown, and it becomes apparent in the conversation that there has been this trauma that they have, that they're not addressing, and they kind of refuse to look at. And he said, there's always a moment where you go, am I going to make their life better by alerting them to the presence of that thing, or am I going to make it worse? Because a lot of people get through their whole life just pretending it's not happening. Occasionally they might have a little turn. They might feel a bit funny for a couple of days every few months or every few years. And like my dad is like the prime example of this. The man has been through a lot. He came from a really horrifying home environment. He's had so many terrible things happen to him, and he just, and every now and then he this thing occurs which he describes as, I got a bit silly, by which he means he had a little bit of a breakdown, but then he just pushed it back down again. And he's got to the point in his life now where he just doesn't lay down memories for negative events, which is interesting.
Wow.
But I think if he tried to unpack that now, I think it would just tear him apart. I don't think he would, you know, he's 75 now. I think he doesn't have the communication capacity to process that. So yeah, that was the thing that really surprised me. Steve was like, you know, sometimes just pretending it's not happening can be all right.
Yeah, I found that really surprising too. Yeah, just really fascinating when he was like, actually, maybe, you know, this, sometimes it can be quite a healthy thing that we just automatically do, is just squash it down.
And I've certainly found that being diagnosed with anxiety means that when I'm feeling a bit unsettled, I'm like, oh, I'm anxious. Oh no, and that can make it worse. Whereas if you're a person who's like, oh, I feel a bit shit and hungover, I'm probably fine. Having that word is so powerful, but it also can be very all-consuming.
It's about trying to find the balance, isn't it? Which is never as easy as it sounds. One of our great coping mechanisms in life in general, I think, is humor. And one of my favorite moments in the book is what you describe, this incident of very public queefing that you experienced. Now, for the uninitiated among you, the G-rated definition of queefing is basically when you pass wind from your front instead of from your back. So, Sarah, in the book, when you talk about this, you're able to laugh about it at the time. How important do you think it is for us to be able to have a good old laugh at our own bodies?
Essential. It's so essential. Oh my God. One of the, my partner is in the room just cackling at me. So one of the things that I really wanted to be present in the book is humor and a kind of an eye for absurdity, because I find that to be the most extraordinary coping mechanism. Because when things are totally avalanching on you, being able to go, this is just so ridiculous, is really reassuring. And I find that I'm one of those people who I'll meet someone and then 20 minutes later they're telling me about the most horrifying thing that ever happened to them. They've never told anybody. And I think a lot of that is because humor and levity, if you know that there's kindness, and if you know that there's a certain gravity beneath it, it makes people feel really safe. And so, yeah, like when someone comes to you, I think Are You Okay Days, there's been a lot of conversations about, oh, you know, it's ridiculous because it doesn't equip anyone to deal with it if the answer is no, I'm not okay. And I know a lot of people who have disclosed to me, you know, some fairly serious mental health experiences. And I found the most powerful response when someone discloses something like that is to pause and go, mate, that sounds fucked. And that laughter that provokes allows someone to be like, you know, it is really fucked. And then the conversation can flow from there, because fear stops up conversation and shame stops up conversation. And, you know, like, I think part of the reason that we didn't know that people had as high rates of mental health conditions in the past was because it was shockingly shameful to talk about. Yeah. Whereas now, you know, if someone's like, hey, I couldn't cross the street today because I was having, if you can be like, oh, you fucking idiot, you just have to walk across the road. Like there is this process where it shatters some fear that surrounds the experience, and it allows for conversation, and that is so essential. Just being able to talk is so essential.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you had a piece in The Guardian, I think a couple of weeks ago, just talking about the experience of writing the book. And you mentioned in that piece how important it was to you when you were pitching this book to stress that it also be funny. But do you think that we are still underrating humor as a way of illuminating tricky or complex subjects like the ones that you tackle in this collection?
I think classically humor and comedy have been underrated for their power, and it's interesting because, you know, there's this trope that comedies never win Best Picture at the Oscars, but it's pretty easy to make someone cry in a film. You just play some string music and put things in slow motion and do a close-up of people's eyes. But to make someone laugh is hard. It's nuanced, and I mean, I suppose I'm kind of biased because I spent my entire MFA writing about how powerful humor is at opening up conversations about deep and complex things. My arts practice kind of seeks to do that, and it's kind of a form of gentle trickery where you make someone laugh and they come towards you and you're like, hey, now that you're here, we can have a chat about dying and being afraid and feeling terrified about the future, because you've already taken a few steps towards me, and you know that I'm not going to hurt you because there's joy and generosity here. And I think, there's this real notion that serious things have to be treated seriously. But humor is a way, what humor is it's a way of acknowledging absurdity and acknowledging that something isn't going the way you expect it to. And I don't know about you, but my life, I'm constantly expecting to be like a movie, cinematic, beautiful. You walk out, the wind blows your hair, your single tear drops into your face, like, and it's never like that. It's never like that. Usually when really dramatic things are happening to me, there's some stupid feature like someone's just been diagnosed with some terrible condition and girls just want to have fun is playing on the speaker above you. And I think Contested Breath is kind of the real culmination of that in the book, which is the essay about my mum dying and the pandemic beginning, because there's all these moments which even at the time were very funny, like like neighbors turning up and being like, look, I actually wasn't informed that your mum had died and I'm quite worried that I might have COVID. What do I do? And we were like, I don't know. Maybe you could go to your hospital where you work. Like, and being able to laugh at those things was a way of acknowledging again that it's impossible to control the world, that the illusion of control, it helps us get through. But when you can sort of laugh at the idea that we would expect things to go the way we want, it really helps to make you go, all right, well, I guess we're just going to keep coping.
Yeah, absolutely. Life is fundamentally absurd. So, it's the only way that we can get through it. Yeah. Let's talk about sex. So there is really interesting essay from, I think, 2018 by Amia Srinivasan, and it's called "Does Anyone Have the Right to Sex?" And she talks about the way that sexual desire is as political as it is personal, and she touches on this really interesting idea of kind of actively changing our desires so that we're not just seeing certain types of socially acceptable bodies as beautiful. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that this is possible? Do you think that our desire is malleable when it comes to bodies?
Well, I think the thing is, our desire is learned, like everything else about our personalities. And I sort of write in the book about having this moment of knowing whether the appeal of having a hand on my throat or putting a hand on someone else's throat in sex was something that I would even have wanted if I hadn't seen it in porn or films or had it kind of performed on me. Like if I could grow up among the wolves but then who knows what kinky shit the wolves are into. But, if I could grow up in a totally asocial environment and then have sex, what would I want? And I think the answer to that would be, well, probably whatever the first few people I slept with were into would help mold my own desires. So, like our brains are incredibly plastic. We learn very rote ways of engaging with sex. But yeah, absolutely. I think there are ways of kind of gaming our own brains and saying, okay, like porn actually is very good at doing this, because what it does is it shows you, you're 13 and you're typing in sex video, and then it gives you a bunch of videos, and then you're like, oh, I wonder what else there is. And then it slowly takes you down this kind of horrifying wormhole until there's this kind of trope of people finishing masturbating and being like, what the fuck? What was I just watching? Like, how did this happen? So porn naturally is like aware that humans really crave novelty. It's like, but what about this? What about this? What about this? What about what? And if there's a way that we can actively do that to ourselves and go, hey, what if you took in data that was different and expanded your capacity for desire in a way that was kind of healthy? And there are porn producers who are working to create ethical porn. And also, just exposing yourself to different, types of bodies and different types of ways of engaging with the world, different sexualities, different gender identities. Just knowing that these things exist is the first thing that has to occur before you can desire them. So yeah, I think there is absolutely an argument to be made for expanding capacity in that way. Sex ed doesn't do a very good job of it. I certainly didn't when I was a young person.
And look, hopefully we're moving towards a future in which us being more aware of the ways that our desires are very shaped by society and the world around us. Yeah. Maybe that awareness will help us just think about desire in a different way. That kind of leads into what I think will probably be my last question, and then we might throw to you for a quick reading before we move to audience questions.
Sure.
So I wanted to finish up by asking you a big question, no pressure, about your thoughts on the future of the body. So we live in complicated times. Even just in the last decade, social media has caused, I think, a lot of significant shifts in the way that we relate to our bodies and the bodies of people around us. Mm-hmm. How do you see that evolving over, say, the next decade?
It's a big question, Carody. These predictions are always, you're always kind of doomed to be foolishly incorrect, aren't you? I have a friend who, David Finnegan, makes a lot of work in the kind of crossover between performance and science. And he and some friends right at the start of the pandemic made a series of predictions about what they thought the pandemic would mean and do. And he was asked recently in a panel, where were you most wrong? And he went, I thought because we wouldn't be seeing anybody, breath mints would tank. But it hadn't occurred to me that when you're in a mask, you're very involved with your own breath. So actually, breath mint sales have skyrocketed, which I thought was just the most.
Who would have thunk it?
I know. It was just the most beautiful kind of crystallization of trying to predict anything.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing two things happen, which is kind of the way that human culture tends to shift, I think, where on the one hand, there's this process of pushing outward, and that process is being driven by queer people and by young people and by BIPOC people. There's this kind of pushing of definitions of being like these old ways of existing in the world and of demarcating how we are, they're boring and they don't serve us. And actually there are totally different ways of being. And then you've got this kind of resulting backlash, which we're seeing in America at the moment with Texas, criminalizing abortion. And there's this kind of dance. And my hope is that, though, as these backlash people die of COVID in America because they're not wearing masks and they're idiots, that this slow drag of culture forward just continues to nose us a little bit further into the future. Because, I mean, if you look at things like women's rights around abortion, for example, if you were talking to me 20 years ago, we'd be in this really dire situation, including in Australia. A lot of the ways that we are used to being in the world would have been totally incomprehensible recently, including, the number of joyous re-engagements with gender identity that have occurred with a lot of people in my life had just been so fucking great to watch and to go, oh, actually, all these ways that we talked about being when I was 15, that's not how we talk about being now. And that's thrilling. So my hope is that this slow, the front of culture will just keep dragging the back of culture slowly. And maybe we'll get to come to a point where we all just calm down a bit. Hopefully. I mean, the pandemic has been interesting because everyone's rediscovered track pants and not shaving their legs. And it's been good.
Wonderful.
So, but yeah.
It's been a dream.
Who knows if we'll keep it once we're, able to see humans again.
Well, I think that is a lovely and hopeful note to end the conversation on. So thank you so much. That was fascinating. And we barely scratched the surface of all of the ideas that are in this book. So if you haven't had a chance to purchase a copy yet, then I would encourage you to get your hands on one. Let's, before we throw to questions, give people a little taster. So Sarah, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little reading, and then I'll throw back to Jana for audience questions.
I feel like I am a strong believer in these readings always being the most ridiculous parts of the book and not the deep theory research ones. So strap in. By the time I had my first kiss, I was carrying a mental file stuffed with material set to the soundtrack of swelling strings. The first kiss was a threshold I longed to cross. I fretted about it. I dreamt about it. I practiced fervently at night, administering tenderly to the side of my curled hand. As it happened, my first kiss was broadcast on national television. I spent much of my 15th year on the set of a children's program set aboard a spaceship. My character had a robotic brain implant and could speak telepathically to a computer. She shared a sweet flirtation with another crew member whose light-hearted antics clashed gently with her terse, logical personality. At some point in the whirl of the 40 episodes of the first and only season, my character was rendered comatose by interference from a nearby star. It was a great job. I highly recommend. Once the rest of the crew solved that problem, I woke like Sleeping Beauty to find my spiky-haired paramour standing over me. As my eyes focused, I pulled him down by the front of his uniform and kissed him. When I first received the script, I read the words, "They kiss," with a thrill of excitement and terror. I confessed my inexperience to the makeup department, who fizzed with vicarious glee. When the shoot day came, I shivered with nerves as middle-aged men bustled around me, adjusting lights. There were dozens of takes from various angles. I kissed my co-star again and again. When I walked off set, the makeup artist crowded around, grinning. "Well, how was it?" I looked at the floor. Wet. When I finally kissed a boy who wasn't being paid for it, the experience was not an improvement. His tongue sprang erratically between my teeth, drawing enormous wet loops. When we pulled apart, I waited until he looked away before I hurriedly ran the sleeve of my jumper across my cheeks to mop up the spit. At night, I lay in bed and wondered whether this festival of saliva could truly be the great culmination of human romance. When I was about 12, my mother steeled herself one evening to deliver the sex talk once and once only. It was mostly befuddling medical jargon and technical names interspersed with stern orders about condom use. I stood in the living room and tried to sink into the floor to avoid the crushing embarrassment of the situation. Finally, she paused, softened, and said, "This is the closest that two people can get to each other." Head swimming with descriptions of cell division and gushing tubes, a tiny sliver of my heart jagged, and I thought, surely there must be closer. Surely there must be more. Surely that can't be enough. Yes.
Wonderful. I think Festival of Saliva is one of my favorite descriptions of a ever. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I'll throw back over to the lovely Jana from Avid Reader to handle audience questions.
Thanks, Carody. Yes, I have to agree. Festival Saliva was very visceral. We've got a few questions coming in. We've got one from Hannah, and she says, thanks for this really interesting conversation, Sarah. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm excited to. I'd like to know, how did you end up writing this book? How did it come about, and what was your process? And I think this might also answer Sarah's question, which is about what inspired you to write the book.
Sure. I mean, in terms of what inspired me to write the book, it was sort of the culmination of about 10 years of earnest conversations with people late at night about what it is to kind of be in a body. And at the start of 2020, before everything happened, I spent a month just generating text. I wrote 1,000 words every day for a month. And when I started to pull that text together, I realized that all of it was about the body. And in some ways that was kind of surprising to me. I sort of wasn't aware at the time of how much the kind of horror of being embodied fed into every aspect of my life and my thinking. In terms of the kind of publication process, I worked with Aviva Tuffield from UQP, who kind of hassled me until I created a book pitch, which was amazing. And I was very, very lucky to have her support and her belief, because I'd written a couple of essays, and she said, I think I've got a book, you've got a book in you. And I was like, oh gosh, I don't know. But so yeah, I sort of pulled that together. And then once I had generated that kind of source material, the book itself was written in about 5 months. And for each essay, I allowed myself 3 weeks to create the bulk of it. The first week was just a sort of process of just churning material out. I wanted to just kind of write to the bottom of the tank. The second week was a process of kind of like deep research and sort of like drawing connections that existed through the text and needed to be deepened with data and with kind of academia. And then there was a process of tightening and very, very aggressive editing. I like, on average, the essays are about 6,000 words long, and they mostly started at about 14. And then it was a process of just hacking and slashing and refining with Aviva's really extraordinary help. Yeah.
And talking about process, I actually really wanted to know, so if you haven't got your hands on the book yet, there are some really gorgeous photographs at the beginning of every chapter. And I was wondering if you could tell us about those.
Yeah, absolutely. So UQP sort of said, well, I mean, you are a photographer, we might as well put some photos in the book. And so one very sweaty afternoon, I don't know why I picked just such a hot day, I was out in the back room with a backdrop taking a series of self-portraits that felt like they reflected some quality of the essay. So there's 8 essays, there's 8 self-portraits, and it had been a long time since I'd shot self-portraits. I did a lot of them at the start of my career, and they're a pain to do when you're kind of naked, sort of like hitting the camera and then running and trying to get in position. And yeah, but that was actually a really lovely process of kind of refining and winnowing all of the ideas in the essay into an image, to the picture that speaks 6,000 words.
We've got a question from Olivia, and she says, your writing seems so open and direct. Would it be okay to say something about how your relationship with control intersects with the process of writing? What's it like to send your work out into the world?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I'm so controlled in so many ways of my life, but I for some reason have just always been very comfortable talking about the kind of darker experiences of things that have happened to me. And I don't, that sort of shame filter that says, oh no, don't tell people that, they'll think you're weird. I don't particularly have, although I like to think I'm pretty good at identifying the kind of time and the place, but I've always found that really, really deep conversations I've had with people, they've been the best when we've both been able to be really honest and vulnerable and self-aware about the way that we talk about our own experiences. And I think because I've worked for a long time in a client capacity as a photographer, I've had a lot of experience of pouring a lot of work into something and having a client be like, actually, I don't like that we use blue. We have to reshoot the whole thing. And so I think I'm pretty good at taking criticism, and I'm good at trusting people who have a lot of experience. So, I deeply, deeply trusted Aviva's feedback, and then the feedback from Margot, who was my line editor, and all the staff at UQP, so that when Aviva sort of got back to me and went, look, this essay doesn't work, but here's some very specific things I've identified why. Oh my God, it was delightful, because obviously all this makes sense to me because it came out of my head. So having an intelligent, articulate, insightful reader say, hey, here's what I didn't understand, here's what didn't work for me, here's actually, I think the point of what you're trying to say was like so joyous. It was wonderful. Good enough.
And then we do have a question from Hannah, and she asks, how does mental health affect your writing? Mainly similarly, how does it affect kind of putting your thoughts and feelings out into the world, and kind of also putting pen to paper, being brutally honest? Were there ever times where you felt like you did need to filter yourself?
I think they're often, like with Contested Breath, for example, the essay about my mum, the first pass of that had a lot of quite graphic descriptions in it around her death, which I wrote and was very glad that I'd written, and writing that was a process of narrativizing it for myself, which I think for a lot of people with anxiety, the process of narrativization can be really powerful, and also can kind of trap you into these stories about yourself. But I found it very helpful to kind of think through writing, and for writing to reveal things to me about my own thought process that I didn't realize were there, or that were kind of undercurrents in my day-to-day thinking. So yeah, in some of the chapters, there was stuff that I wrote and looked at and immediately went, yeah, that's going. But I needed to know it was there underpinning the rest of the writing. So yeah, certainly it wasn't just a kind of vomiting on the page and being like, great, here, have all of my trauma, have all the, like the really unresolved, messy parts that, when I was talking before about the theatre having to learn how to care for its audience, I was very, very aware of wanting to do that for my readers as well, because I've read things where you read an experience that someone's had and you're like, I don't know where to put that, because I don't think you've processed that, and I don't know how I'm meant to process it. It's not even mine. So yeah, I was kind of aware of wanting to go through that process of allowing care for the reader.
We've got a question from Rebecca, and she says, wondering if there's any news about the audiobook. I still really love the idea of Virginia Gay reading it.
I know, I haven't heard anything. Yeah, I feel great about Virginia Gay reading it. Oh my God. I think I'd listen to it to fall asleep with a kind of like cheeky grin on my face. Yes, I'm not sure what the updates on that situation are, but hopefully.
And then our final question is from Susan, and she says, thanks, Sarah. I'm really delighting in reading your book this weekend. Can you share the essayists you enjoy reading?
Oh my goodness. Maggie Nelson. Maggie Nelson is the essayist who I read and went, oh my God. Oh, I understand why people write essays now. I understand this genre. I understand how you can be very generous with your knowledge. I read some writers where I think, you're very clever, but I think you're not letting me into your cleverness. And I love Maggie Nelson's generosity. I love Ocean Vuong's essays. He's known primarily for his poetry and for his prose, but his essays are just glorious because they have this ability to simultaneously be devastatingly close and also have this very deep distance to them and sort of self-awareness. What else did I read recently that I really liked? Yeah, I think they're the people that are kind of really touchstone writers for me. I tried while I was writing the book to not read any essays because I didn't want to kind of pick up the habits of other writers. So I'm kind of getting back into this lovely nonfiction space now of being able to kind of read very expansively again instead of being like, don't look at it. Yeah.
That pretty much brings us right to the end. Carody, do you have any final words?
Just thanks very much. That was a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much, Sarah. And I'm just grateful that we were still able to do this event, even though we weren't able to gather in person.
I can't wait to be able to come to Brisbane at some point and experience.
We can't wait to have you.
Yeah, great. And thanks so much, avid reader. You're a very good host.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us on a Friday. Sad we can't be together in person. We've got a lot of virtual claps and love hearts coming in the chat. Have a great weekend, everyone. Sarah, thank you so much. Congratulations on a fantastic book. I'm so excited to get stuck into it this weekend. Remember to buy it from your local independent bookstore or avid reader if you are in Brisbane, but especially support your local lockdown bookstore. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.